Right, and to conclude the lecture, this is part 5. I'm going to get into something that I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture in part 1. There's the peripheral nervous system and its two primary components, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. I know it gets a little confusing because there's all these different nervous systems, but there are diagrams in the book to help organize all this information. The somatic nervous system, or SNS, transmits sensory signals and motor signals between the central nervous system and the skin, muscles, and joints. The autonomic nervous system, or ANS, transmits sensory signals and motor signals between the central nervous system and the body's glands and internal organs. So the somatic, and that term somatic, it means, feeling, touch, that kind of thing. So that's your clue that it's what connects to skin, muscles, and joints. The autonomic is more for the inside of the body, where it's connecting to the glands and internal organs and communicating with them. As I mentioned, here's these diagrams from the books that help organize all this information. This is an expanded diagram from earlier in the lecture. So we talked about the central nervous system consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. So under it is where the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system exist. Now it gets a little bit trickier because underneath autonomic nervous system is yet another set of nervous systems which I'll expand on next. The sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Remember that was underneath autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division prepares the body for action. The parasympathetic division returns the body to its resting state. Most internal organs are controlled by inputs from sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Here's another diagram of the book that lays out the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Here you can see, in terms of the eyes, the sympathetic division can control the pupils and dilate them. For the parasympathetic, it would contract the pupils. In terms of the lung, the sympathetic relaxes the bronchi, and the parasympathetic would constrict that. On and so forth for the heart, stomach, and blood vessels. And now on to the endocrine system, and it communicates through hormones. The endocrine system is a communication system that uses hormones to influence thoughts, behaviors, and actions. The main difference is that the nervous system uses electrochemical signals, whereas the endocrine system uses hormones to communicate. Hormones are chemical substances released from endocrine glands that travel through the bloodstream to targeted tissues. The tissues are subsequently influenced by the hormones. And now we must talk about the pituitary gland. This is a gland located at the base of the hypothalamus. It sends hormonal signals to other endocrine glands, controlling their release of hormones. Neuroactivation causes the hypothalamus to secrete a particular releasing factor, which causes the pituitary gland to release a hormone specific to that factor. For example, growth hormone, GH. It promotes bone, cartilage, and muscle tissue to grow or helps them regenerate after injury. How does the brain change? You might have thought that it doesn't, but it can. Despite the great precision and specificity of its connections, the brain is extremely adaptable. In a term called plasticity, it is the property of the brain that allows it to change as a result of experience or injury. Here's a good example to talk about extreme plasticity. While in her mother's womb, a Michelle Mack suffered a stroke that obliterated her left hemisphere, shown here in a scan on the left of these two images when she was an adult. She's missing half her brain. The black areas on the right is the empty part. It's kind of scary and alarming, because it is. Over time, Mac's right hemisphere took over the duties of the left hemisphere, language production and moving the right side of the body to a surprising extent. Mac's case shows the plasticity of the brain. How is she able to do everything she does in her life normally with only half a brain? This is an example of that plasticity of the brain overcoming obstacles so that she can still live her life. The brain rewires itself throughout life. Chemical signals influence cell growth and cell function. Experiences, particularly during critical periods, influence cell development and neuronal connections. These critical periods could be stages of growth, adolescence. Connections formed between brain structures when growing axons are directed by certain chemicals that tell them where to go and where not to go. Plasticity and aging. Plasticity decreases with age, but neural connections are made throughout your lifespan. This means that, say you're 12 years old and you suffer a traumatic brain injury, your brain will be more likely to recover from that and change and allow to adapt to your life. Whereas if the same thing happened in your age 80, your brain will not be able to regenerate itself quite the same way. The production of new neurons is called neurogenesis. The brain can recover from injury, as I just intimated. Recovery and reorganization can occur most easily in the brains of children. Remapping seems to begin immediately after injury, and it continues for years. Sometimes this also occurs after an amputation. The functions of portions of the cerebral cortex shift in response to their activity. So if you have something amputated, the neurons closest to it in the brain will take over those areas and they will become more robust and stronger. In the case of a phantom limb, this is an intense sensation that the amputated body part still exists. The best example of this, unfortunately, comes from our wars that we have fought in the past. Let's say in the example, somebody loses their hand in an explosion that happens while serving for the military. As this explosion happens and they lose that part of their arm, they tense their muscles. In their mind, they're still tensing those muscles, but those muscles are no longer there. This causes extreme pain and discomfort for the person suffering from phantom limb. There is a solution for it, though. And if you remember a show called House, there's an episode that specifically dealt with it. And the trick to fix it is this box that has a mirror in it. They stick in their unaffected arm, and then they also stick in their affected arm into this box. But what they see, because of the mirror, is a reflection of their unaffected arm. And they're then told to let go of the muscles that tensed up when the explosion happened in the first place. And this works. They are able to let go of those neuronal connections in the brain and stop feeling pain. And all it took was a box with a mirror. Might want to look up that episode or search phantom limb on the internet. It'll tell you a whole lot more about it. It sure is it's interesting. All right, what is the genetic basis of psychological science? The term genetics is typically used to describe how characteristics are passed along to offspring and the processes involved in turning genes on and off. Genes are the units of heredity that help determine the characteristics of an organism. And gene expression is whether a particular gene is turned on or off. Human development has a genetic basis. The genome is a master blueprint for making an entire organism. The genome provides the option, and the environment determines which option is taken. Chromosomes are structures within the cell body that are made up of DNA. These are segments of which comprise of individual genes. The human body down to its genes. Each cell in the human body includes pairs of chromosomes, which consist of DNA strands. DNA has a double helix shape, and the segments of it consist of the individual genes. This is a series of imagined close-up pictures that show these genes. Heredity involves passing along genes through reproduction. Around 1866, a Gregor Mendel cross-pollinated different colored pea plants to see which color flowers the plants would produce. He used selective breeding, and he discovered clues to the mechanisms responsible for heredity. There's something called a dominant gene and a recessive gene. A dominant gene is one that is expressed in the offspring whenever it is present, and a recessive gene is a gene that is expressed only when it is matched with a similar gene from another parent. All right, parent plants display genetic differences. The fellow that I mentioned named Mendel, he studied pea plants. To observe the effects of crossbreeding, he started with pea plants with purple flowers and pea plants with white flowers, messed with the genes, and saw what the outcomes were. Genotype and phenotype. A genotype is a genetic constitution of an organism, and it is determined at the moment of conception. A phenotype is an observable physical characteristics which result from both genetic and environmental influences. Genetics nature and environment nurture both influence phenotype, which brings us back to that argument I mentioned in the other lecture, nature versus nurture. Genes can affect behavior. A person's abilities and psychological traits are influenced by the interaction of genes and environment. Behavioral genetics is the study of how genes and environment interact to influence psychological activity. Behavioral genetics methods. Behavioral geneticists use two methods to assess the degree to which traits are inherited. They use twin studies and then look at the differences between twins. Twin studies compare different types of twins to determine the genetic basis of specific traits. There are two types of twins, monozygotic and dizygotic. Monozygotic twins, also called identical twins, are twin siblings that result from one zygote splitting in two and therefore share the same genes. Dizygotic twins, also called fraternal twins, are twin siblings that result from two separately fertilized eggs and therefore are no more similar genetically than non-twin siblings. The greater similarity of monozygotic twins raised together or apart is likely due to genetic influence. They can really get at things by seeing if, say, one twin is separated from another and raised by a different family. They share the same genes, but due to the difference in environment, there will be differences between the people. All right, here's a diagram explaining the differences between monozygotic identical twins and dizygotic fraternal twins. Behavioral genetics methods continued. Adoption studies, that's what I was just referencing. Adoption studies compare biological relatives and adoptive relatives. Non-biological adopted siblings may share similar home environments, but they will have different genes. Therefore, the assumption is that similarities among non-biological adopted siblings have more to do with the environment than with genes that they do not share. Understanding heritability. Heredity is the transmission of characteristics from parents to offspring through genes. Heritability is a statistical estimate of the extent to which variation in a trait within a population is due to genetics. Heritability refers to populations, not to individuals. Estimates of heritability are concerned only with the extent that people differ in terms of their genetic makeup within a group. Epigenetics. Here, the environment is seen as layered over genetics. Epigenetics literally means on top of genetics. Epigenetics researchers are looking at the processes by which the environment affects genetic expression. The potential implications of epigenetics for understanding health problems and health benefits are enormous. Got to think of this in terms of something from the environment enters our bodies and then affects gene expression. And optogenetics. This is the modification of genes to trigger action potentials in neurons. This research technique provides precise control over when a neuron fires. These techniques allow researchers to show that activating or deactivating specific neurons causes changes in brain activity and behavior. And thus concludes Chapter 3, which is a pretty heavy chapter full of a lot of serious science.